Oh, I don't have a,
What's that, John?
you don't have the list up yet. Is that
Yeah,
true?
it's there.
It's up there.
Sophia.
It
And
is?
you were after Joe. You will be the third reader, Joan.
Why
Do
don't
you
I
not
get it?
see it?
Oh, yeah, there it is. I had to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, for those of you who are watching this video, um, we are actually going to begin the body of the book, My Brother's Keeper, today, written by James Joyce's brother, Stanislaus Joyce. And without further ado, I will begin. And let's start with chapter 1, The Soil. My recollections of my brother go back to such early years that I hardly dare say how far back they go. At any rate, to nursery days, I have a recollection, definitely indefinite enough, though vague in detail, of a dramatic performance of the story of Adam and Eve, organized for the benefit of his parents and nursemaid. I was Adam, and his sister, my elder by less than a year, was Eve. My brother was the devil. What I remember what I remember indistinctly is my brother wiggling across the floor with a long tail, probably made up of rolled up sheet or towel. Of what he said, I have, of course, no memory. But it must have made the original myth seem funny. And as taking the guilt of myth off the gingerbread of reality was to form so large a part of his work, may be worth recording. There were other nursery theatricals that I remember more distinctly, but they belonged to a year or two later. And though one at least was comic in intention, were not so interesting as the child's first attempt to visualize the sacred history stories he had been told, and his instinctive realization of the fact the most important part dramatically, which he reserved for himself, was that of the tempter. Joe.
We lived at that time at Bray, within a stone's throw of the sea, in the house on Martello Terrace next to the baths. The terrace ran straight down to the water's edge, and in winter the sea sometimes dashed over the sea wall and flooded the road in front of the house till it was awash with the doorstep. From our windows, we had a long view of the esplanade, which stretched along the seafront half the way to Bray Head, and behind it there was an equally long green enclosure with a bandstand and, Dixendian touch, rude donkey boys. Behind Martello Terrace were lanes and fishermen's cottages and a long strand reaching to Killiney. About the earliest impression I can recall is that of standing ankle deep in the thin, flat ripples on that strand on an early summer morning while my father, swimming a long way out, was lost in the dazzling reflection of the sun on the level sea. Joan.
My brother's fear of dogs and preference for cats dates from the time when he was badly bitten by an excited Irish terrier, for which he and I were throwing stones into the sea on the beach near the sea bathing establishment, which is, or was, in the middle of the esplanade. The wounds, which looked both sore and sad, were medicated by a doctor, or Mr. Vance, a friend of my father's, who had a chemist shop somewhere on the seafront. He was a cheerful, hard-working chemist whose wife suffered from heart disease and spent the greater part of the day on the sofa reading novels. His devotion to her was often the subject of comment among his friends, most of whom habitually neglected their wives. But the comment was not altogether hostile, because he was too clever and vivacious in company to incur contempt. In a jerky, humorous manner, like that of the comic actor Edward Terry, Ellen Terry's brother, whom he somewhat resembled in appearance, too. He would tell stories of the disasters which he and a stupid servant, a female handy Andy, caused in his house, as, for example, when he failed to turn up at a card party that she had put so much pepper in an Irish stew that the whole family, including the servant, had been obliged to spend the rest of the evening sitting around the kitchen tap. Donna?
Vance's elder daughter, Eileen, who comes into the early part of a portrait of the artist, was a couple of years older than my brother, a pale, oval-faced girl with long, dark hair, which she often wore in plaits over each shoulder in front, framing her face. She was already well aware of the effect. She seemed cold and distant, but she was not so by any means. When my brother was at Clongowes, she wrote him a letter, happily intercepted by my mother, which concluded with this verse showing the hand of her father. "Oh, Jimmy Joyce, you are my darling, you are my looking glass night and morning. I'd rather have you without a farthing than Johnny Jones with his ass and garden." There's a note saying that Vance adapted the lines from Samuel Lover's chapter Ballads and Ballad Singers in his Legends and Stories of Ireland, where they are given, "Oh, Thady Brady, you are my darling, you are my looking glass from night till morning. I love you better without one farthing than Brian Gallagher with house and garden."
It's funny.
Mm-hmm. Lois?
Though my brother has borrowed this verse and some luxurious traits for the making of Bloom, Vance did not otherwise resemble Leopold. He was spare and sprightly and always welcome because he was good company. Moreover, his wife was really ill. She died young a few years later. That they were Protestants in no way interfered with the friendship between them and our family. My father and mother never gave the matter a thought, but there was one member of our household who seemed to think that she imperiled her precious soul by sitting down to play cards with the Vances, and who, whenever she could do so, made trouble. It was the woman who appears in a portrait of the artist as Mrs. Reardon, and of whom I shall speak presently. Vance was one of the small group of friends who shared my father's high hopes for his precocious youngster. After all, they were not so greatly mistaken. He died while my father, as a schoolboy in the upper classes, was still fulfilling those hopes. My brother liked him and introduces him by his right name in a portrait of the artist. The mention bears witness here, as elsewhere in a portrait and Ulysses, to a grateful memory. Next.
In the case of the writer whose early impressions were so vivid and lasting, and who moreover deliberately chose the Dublin of his adolescence as the main, if not the sole subject matter of his artistic production, it is not idle to ask how those impressions became so firmly fixed in his mind. In this regard, the ingenuous admiration of those simple-minded people, untinged with envy, though some had children of their own, is a factor not to be overlooked. He was not the firstborn. The first boy died in infancy, but he was the eldest of the family, handsome and clever. He amused friends of the family in much the same way that Dickens is said to have done at about the same age. His precocity and independence as a very young child were remembered when he passed out of the university and was beginning to know as a young man of promise, or rather, to say it with Dubliners, as a young fellow with a great future behind him. Stories were told of how, when not yet 4 years of age, he entertained relatives who had turned up unexpectedly in his parents' absence by playing the piano for them and singing, or of his habit at a still earlier age of coming at dessert time down the stairs from the nursery, one step at a time, with the nursemaid in attendance, and calling out from the top of the house until he reached the dining room door, "Here's me, here's me." It was an appropriate entrance for the author whose last creation was to be HCE, "Here Comes Everybody." Or again, when he was 7, of his riding on his tricycle from the outskirts of Dublin to Bray to visit a nurse, while his sorrowing parents sought him among kinsfolk and acquaintance. The effect of such a heady diet of admiration in childhood might have been to make the boy a prig, but the natural attritions in the large family, soon to be in a state of gradual impoverishment, were unfavourable to the growth of such a characteristic. In the tense sensibility and raw realism of the parts of a poet and an artist that deal with those years, there is no trace of priggishness. And
Yeah. His first educator was the woman who, in a portrait of the artist, is called Mrs. Reardon, and whom he and the rest of us after him called Dante, probably a childish mispronunciation of Auntie. She had, in fact, in embryo an influence not unlike that of her great namesake, for besides teaching him to read and write with some elementary arithmetic and geography, she inculcated a great deal of very bigoted Catholicism and bitterly anti-English patriotism, the memory of the penal laws being still a thorn in the flesh of Irish men and women when I was a boy. Her name was Mrs. Conway, and she seems to have been some distant relative of my father's. She lived with us for several years, and was owing to her preparation that my brother was accepted at Clongowes Woods College, the principal Jesuit college in Ireland, when he was little over 6 years of age. Mrs. Conway was unlovely and very stout. She used to wear in the house one of those funny little caps which in photographs enhance the fading beauty of Queen Victoria. As I remember her, she seems always to have been sitting down somewhere impossibly, and she had a surliness of temper that in Ireland is associated, no doubt unjustly, with the Reformed Church of Christ. She must have suffered from sciatica, I fancy, because she always had great difficulty sitting down and standing up, and performed both feats to the accompaniment of exclamations of pain. Oh, my back, my back, my back. And again, there's a little footnote there. Oh, my back, my back, my back. Finnegan's Wake, page 213, which I used to imitate pretty accurately for the amusement of the nursery. She had her burst of energy, however, for I remember the scandal mentioned in a portrait of the artist that she created one fine summer evening when a military band was concluding its program of music on the bandstand behind the esplanade. While the band was playing God Save the Queen, she interrupted the loyal rapture of an elderly gentleman who was standing up, hat in hand, listening to the anthem, by giving him a rap on the noodle with her parasol. No. Katrina, follow that.
Many years before she had entered a convent with the intention of becoming a nun, but before she had taken her final vows, a brother of hers died and bequeathed her a rather large sum of money. She left the convent and soon got married to a husband whom she must certainly have considered a judgment sent from heaven. I have heard him described as being tall, solemn, and bald-headed. He had a good position in the Bank of Ireland, where he used to keep a pair of trousers to wear in his office so that he could always appear in public with his best trousers elegantly creased. When the young couple were invited to dinner, he would read a book before leaving home in order to have matter for conversation. Besides this, he had a commendable habit of getting up in the middle of the night to pray and incidentally to suck raw eggs. After a couple of years of married life, he decided that he could do better in South America. He certainly did. He left for Buenos Aires with the greater part of his wife's fortune, and she never saw him or it again. She was to have followed him, but his letters, always few and far between, became rarer and rarer. In an elephantine attempt to be playful, his wife wrote to him, quoting a popular song of the day. Jumbo says to Alice, I love you. Alice says to Jumbo, I don't believe you do. For if you really loved me as you say you do, you'd never go to Yankee Town and leave me in the zoo. Next, please.
Okay. This pachydermatous frolicsome so outraged his sense of propriety that after a last indignant letter, he never wrote to her again, and she lost all trace of him. It was an embittering experience, and it befell an appropriate subject. Perhaps she felt that she had some leeway to make up with her conscience. Whatever the cause, she was the most bigoted person I ever had the misadventure to encounter. She was thought to be very clever and shrewd, be a very clever and shrewd woman. In fact, she was by no means stupid, and was allowed to have more than her say in the conduct and education of the children. It was a generation of large families, but with scant understanding of children. Dante was only more definite and consequent than others in her belief that children come into the world trailing murky clouds of original sin. In her bright moments, she used to take us during the Christmas holidays to see the crib at Inchicore, with the wax figures of the Holy Family and the Magi and the shepherds and horses and oxen, sheep, and camels stretched all around the hall in cheap and dusty grandeur. In a sterner mood, she brought us to see a picture entitled The Last Day in the National Gallery. It represented a tremendous cataclysm. Black thunder clouds lowering, lurid lightning flashing, mountaintops crashing down, and little naked figures of the wicked in all the contortions of despair. Oh, why did I do it? Imploring mercy, while huge rocks fell on them. In another corner of the picture, the blessed were being catapulted up to heaven with their arms crossed on their breast. I don't remember whether God Almighty was in the picture or not, but in any case, he was evidently having the time of his life, or perhaps I should say of his eternity, squelching sinners. Joe.
There's a footnote which I can't quite make sense of. It refers to the crib at Inchicore, drinking champagne out of her slipper after the ball was over, like the infant Jesus in the crib at Inchicore in the Blessed Virgin's arms. Sure, no woman could have a child that big taken out of her. Reference to Ulysses there. Right? And I'll skip the other footnote. I don't think it makes much more sense. Anyway, another incident is impressed on my memory. One day, I was out with the nursemaid, walking beside the pram in which there was, I don't remember which, younger brother or sister. We happened to pass through Little Bray when a funeral was starting from one of the two-storied houses there. Perhaps the nursemaid stopped to watch, but just at the moment when they were carrying out a diminutive coffin, a woman rushed screaming to an upper window and made as if to throw herself out, had not the people within the room held her back. In the discussion of the incident which took place when we came home, someone, probably the nursemaid, said that the cause of the mother's despair was that the infant had not been baptized. Dante then explained to us that the child could never go to heaven. Her attitude was, so now you see what happens. The child can never go to heaven. Now you see what comes of not baptizing immediately. We were all duly impressed, for it seemed the most natural thing in creation that God should be some kind of drunken ogre with less mercy even than the small mercy of men. But somewhere in my mind, the incident seems to have been filed for reference. I remember one of our Jesuit teachers at Belvedere College stating impressively during religious instruction when discussing confession and the use of reason, that it had been revealed to, I don't recollect now, which sainted ruffian, probably St. Augustine, that there was a child of 7 years of age in hell. My brother makes some of the Catholic university students in Portrait of the Artist discuss the points and puts some of his anger into the mouth of Temple. Jim used to say that the church was cruel like all old whores. In the novel, he modifies the phrase. Joan.
However, Dante was not altogether without tenderness, for she used to tell the children to bring her the tissue paper that came wrapped round parcels. Footnote, Dante gave him a cachou every time he brought her a piece of tissue paper. In this and subsequent notes, okay. However, Dante was, and when they presented her with some sheets of it before visitors, her economical soul would shake its fat all over with laughter when the visitors had gone. She died very fitly of fatty degeneration of the heart many years later, and no doubt after suitable quarantine in purgatory, will sail up to heaven on the last day in a glorified body that needs no tissue paper, to join the chorus of angels in singing, for he's a jolly gay fellow forevermore. Donna?
The sincerest of the little group of my brother's well-wishers was the man who appears in Portrait of the Artist as Mr. Casey, John Kelly of Tralee. He had been in and out of prison several times for making speeches in support of the Land League agitation. In fact, it was in consequence of these terms of imprisonment that he fell into decline, from which he died some 10 or 11 years later. After he had served a sentence, my father used to invite him to come down to Bray to recuperate at the seaside. I remember his coming to stay with us 3 or 4 times, and the hugger-mugger after his escape up to Dublin to avoid arrest, an escape at night that put an end to what must have been his last visit to Bray. The sergeant who came after dark to give warning that a warrant for Mr. Kelly's arrest had arrived, and that he had delayed its execution until the following morning, was a very tall, sinewy Connacht man who dwarfed my father and Mr. Kelly when they used to talk with him. He hailed from the Joyce country. His name was Joyce, of course, and he was clanishly devoted to my father. There is a mention of the incident in a Portrait of the Artist. Next, please.
I do not think that the family of, so far, 6 young children spoiled John Kelly's enjoyment of the rest and sea air at that pretty seaside resort. Seaside resort seems too big and too modern a name for Bray, with its 100 or so modest summer visitors, though the Queen of Romania, Carmen Silva, did honor us with a visit one summer. Mr. Kelly used to take me out walking and give me donkey rides. My brother cannot have been at home, or I should not have been preferred, so that I reckon it must have been after he had gone up to Clongowes for the first time. If so, I was not yet 4 at the time. I remember very well, however, that on one occasion the donkey ran away with me. When the donkey boy had put me in the saddle and for a moment left his beast unattended, the donkey started off at a gallop with John Kelly and the donkey boy in hot pursuit. It must have been a smart gallop, for they could not overtake the donkey. John Kelly, in any case, was not in training. The road wound up a slight incline, at the top of which there was a level railway crossing. John Kelly, who often used to recall the incident, said that when he saw the red cap I was wearing disappear with its bobbing tassel round the turn of the road, he gave me up for lost. He feared the gates at the level crossing might be shut, and that I should be pitched over them in front of a passing train. But the way was clear, and the donkey continued his gallop. I stuck on and was delighted that at last the donkey had galloped, for I had never been able to cajole the lazy donkey boy into doing more than a jog trot of 40 or 50 yards with his baste. In retrospect, not so blurred even after more than 60 years, my Gilpin ride does not seem to have been so short. After the level crossing, it was past a park or a large garden with high railings, and then, I think, to the left, up the main street of Bray, to the fountain in front of the town hall. He was an Irish donkey, and his outburst of energy was due to the fact that he wanted a drink. Next.
John Kelly of Tralee must, I think, have been a peasant stock. He was a pale and handsome, slow of speech and movement, with regular clean-cut features and a mass of black hair. The fingers of his left hand were permanently cramped from making sacks and picking oakum in jail. And Mr. Casey had told him that He had got those 3 cramped fingers making a birthday present for Queen Victoria, a portrait of the artist as a young man. He had an old-fashioned courtesy and peasant eloquence. In later years, more than once, in exercise on my brother's birthday, a natural gift of friendship and a passionate loyalty to his country and his chief, Parnell. His great expectations for my brother were hardly outdone, even by my father. What he thought my brother might become, I cannot guess. Something in political life? I hardly think so. At any rate, he never tried to influence as Dante did with her narrow, restless, partisan bigotry. If the boy liked to listen, let him listen. He did. Whenever John Kelly came to stay with us, he fell easily into place. He was amused and could be amusing. In a family in which all the children had tunable voices, each one down to the youngest, that could speak, had his or her song, some of them comic songs, which were considered stupid enough for children. My day at this time, or a year or so later, was Finnegan's Wake. Mr. Kelly, also impressed by my father to do so, would recite The Owl Plaid Shawl or Seamus O'Brien, and recite it so movingly that my father would get busy with the tumblers of punch to hide his emotion, or sing for the children his ballad, The Goat. Oh, Pat, says my mother. What's that, ma'am, says I. Take the goat to the market and sell her, do try. Sure, the words were scarce spoke when the goat gave a jump and hit me poor mother a terrible thump. With a whack fall the lardle lie lay. With a whack fall the lardle lie lay. So the words were scarce spoke when the goat gave a jump and hit me poor mother a terrible thump.
He had a pleasant mellow bass and sometimes could be induced to sing the diver or in cellar cool to my mother's accompaniment. Once after they had been up to Dublin in a small party to hear some opera, John Kelly said to my father reflectively, "Do you mind what I'm telling you, John? If you got 3 months in jail, you'd sing any of those fellas off the stage." Uncle Charles was William O'Connell, a maternal uncle of my father's. He formed part of the household as early as I can remember and remained with us until we moved up to Dublin after my father had lost his position owing to the closing down of his offices. I had heard my mother say that in the case of his uncle, my father returned good for evil. For when his father died, his uncle, William O'Connell, then a prosperous businessman in Cork and a bachelor, refused bluntly to take any interest in his orphaned nephew of 17. When I knew him, he was a large, white-haired old man, imperturbable and quietly religious. He took a cold tub and went to Mass every morning, and made himself useful by doing my mother's shopping in the town of Bray, which was at some distance from where we lived. He took me with him on these occasions, but I went unwillingly because he had distressing habits. He would remain for what seemed to me an age, though it was probably only an hour, in talk with the proprietors of shops where he went to order things. When I wandered around the shop looking at labels and advertisements that I knew by heart, or he would take me with him into some chapel on the way home to say 3 Hail Marys for his intention, whatever this might be, was a mystery to be respected. Katrina.
He used to sing, too, in an old man's voice, but not unpleasantly. "Oh, twine me a bower all of woodbine and roses, or in happy moments day by day." They all used to sing. The singing of sentimental ballads was a backwash of that ebbing wave of romanticism in which poetry and all it is wont to express had degenerated. Tommy Moore assisting to a drawing room accomplishment. Whatever happened, nothing could ever upset him. He had his magic formula at all sticky points. "All serene, ma'am, all serene." Very good, Simon, all serene from a portrait of an artist. And his serenity was sometimes put to a rather severe test. During the first summer holidays when my brother had come home from Clongowes, We wanted to play football one afternoon with other young boys on the large green in front of the terrace, but we had no football. My brother had a wild idea, a very rare thing for him. He ran into our house, fetched Uncle William's tall hat from the hall stand, and with that relic of old decency, we played football. Then, adding insult to injury, we filled it with stones and hung it up on the hall stand again. After a first brunt of the storm had passed, my mother and Uncle William, two instinctive peacemakers, were at their wits' end to conceal the mishap to the tall hat from my father, for there was to be a picnic on Bray Head in a few days' time, and some relatives and friends had been invited. Fortunately, Uncle William knew a hatter in Bray who undertook to recondition the hat and restore it to its pristine beauty in time for the picnic. It arrived punctually, looking as good as new, but on the day of the picnic towards the afternoon, the flies discovered it and began to gather on top of it. Whatever stuff the hatter had put in it, it was just their tipple. When one fly had had enough, he flew away to bring the glad tidings of his find to his chums. Next, please. Duncan.
My God, man, said my father, who was rather short-sighted, peering at the cluster of flies. What's the matter with your hat? All the flies on Bray Head are swarming over it. Musha, let them alone, John, said Uncle William. Sure, the creatures are taking their tie. A few years later, but before we left Bray, we used to go with other warlike heroes of the same age to engage the enemy, merchants who lived in the lanes behind Martello Terrace. They were almost always bloody clashes, of which there was a reminiscence in Araby, but they were sufficient at that age to give the thrill of adventure. These incidents, trivial as they were, and such as might happen to any boy, suffice to show that my brother was not the weak, shrinking infant who figures in a portrait of the artist. He has drawn, it is true, very largely upon his life and his own experience, and the vividness of his early impressions is due, in a great part, no doubt, to the fact that at college he suddenly found himself among boys bigger and older, but less intelligent than himself. But a portrait of the artist is not an autobiography, it is an artistic creation. As I had something to say in its reshaping, I can affirm this without hesitation. In Dublin, when he set to work on the first draft of the novel, the idea he had in mind was that of a man's character, like his body, develops from an embryo with constant traits. The accentuation of those traits, the reactions to hereditary influences and environment, were the main psychological lines he intended to follow, and in fact the purpose of the novel as originally planned. As the other characters are often blends of real people fused in the mold of the imagination, so for the character of Stefan, in both drafts of the novel, he has followed his own development closely, been his own model, and chose to use many incidents from his own experience, but he has transformed and invented many others. The first chapters show a boy of subtle and penetrating sensibility, who from his earliest years seizes the images of things to ruminate on them and clarify them in his memory, and who finds in his need to compose the life he knows in a pattern he can understand, a certain byproduct of courage of a kind unknown to his hardier schoolmates. Joe.
Though the treatment is objective, we are, as it were, from first to last, in the center of Stephen's brain. The picture is an interior. The purpose of those present reminiscences is to give a picture of the model from the outside, to be the other eye that adjusts focuses and rounds off contours. The only real weakness my brother showed as a boy was a terror of thunderstorms, a terror excessive even for his years. It was not merely a boy's fear of thunder, it was the realization and terror of death, that dominant passion of the Middle Ages that makes Every Man such a poignant masterpiece, and The Retreat in a Portrait of the Artist hardly less poignant. Until he was 12 or 13, my brother was always beside himself with fear during thunderstorms. He would run upstairs to our room while my mother tried to calm him. He would close the shutters hastily, pull down the blinds, and draw the curtains together. But even that was not enough. He would take refuge in the cupboard until after the storm was over. It was a direct result of the religion of terrorism that Dante had instilled into him. She used to teach us to cross ourselves at every flash of lightning and repeat the rigmarole, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, from a sudden and unprovided for death, deliver us, O Lord. As if she were the canvasser for some kind of religious insurance company. Though almost 3 years younger than my brother, I was entirely unmoved by thunderstorms. And even his terror did not, as often happens with very young children, communicate itself to me. This was due, I think, not only to my being less apt to learn and less imaginative in realizing the significance of what was taught me, but also to the fact that though I was Dante's godson, I disliked the chuffy, domineering woman and was unconsciously resistant to her ideas, religious and patriotic. Briefly, as I had no love for her, I had no love for what she loved. But my brother assimilated her teaching readily and vivified it in his imagination. She had made much of him from infancy, and no doubt in return for her care, he gave her, if not affection, at least respect. John.
His fear of thunderstorms never quite abandoned him. If they were violent, he became restless, as cats do, and could not work. In an article on my brother in the Nuova Antologia, Alessandro Francini Bruni, with whom we shared a flat in the early Bohemian days in Trieste, writes, "When a thunderstorm came on, he quite lost his self-control. He became irresponsible and gave way to acts of cowardice, like a child or silly woman. Panic-stricken, he would clap his hands to his ears, run to crouch in some cupboard, or cuddle up in bed in the dark in order not to see or hear. This is sheer waste of material for a grand opera libretto, La Forza del Rimorso." Either Francini was unable to distinguish in his memory hearsay from actual incidents, or he wanted to work into his article for literary effect the anecdotes of my brother's childhood that he had heard at that time, chiefly from me in my broken Italian, during the prolonged and happy evening gossips of the two young families. In any case, it never happened so. At most, if I were standing at the window looking at the storm, my brother would say to me with glittering eye and exasperated politeness, "Will you be kind enough to close that window, like a good bloody fool?" And then to Francini in Italian, "You know my brother thinks that a thunderbolt knocks at the door before coming in." Next, please. Donna.
So he was always uneasy during bad storms. It took a really startling flash to make him do something demonstrative. One day in midsummer, we were overtaken by a thunderstorm at the corner of Via Fabio Severo. The thick masses of cloud seemed to be resting on the housetops, but it had not yet begun to rain heavily. Suddenly there was a crash of thunder, and at the same time a blaze of lightning lit up the yellow facade of the old Austrian barracks. My brother clapped his hands together and with a cry skipped out onto the roadway. A workman who was passing said, not unkindly, "Corajo, giovanotto, corajo." And I, to make a joke of it, said, "Take it easy, man. You needn't dance a Highland fling about it." We found shelter before the cloudburst came on. He seemed a little mortified, but the next morning he came into my room with the newspaper in his hand to show me that a tree in the garden above Vias Fabio Severo had been struck by lightning. He pointed out the paragraph angrily, as if it had been my fault. That was the only time that I can remember when he gave any outward sign of his agitation, and there was at least some reason for it. Somewhere he calls God a noise in the street. It is a reminiscence of these shocks. He means that the idea of God is something that startles you when you are hard at work and makes you jump up and look out the window. This is certainly a more perturbed approach than the peaceable something not ourselves that, I forget now what. Next.
My brother's major work came at the close of an epoch of Irish, perhaps one may say of European history, to give a comprehensive picture of it in the daily life of a large city. He always held that he was lucky to have been born in a city that is old and historic enough to be considered a representative European capital, and small enough to be viewed as a whole. And he believed that circumstances of birth, talent, and character had made him its interpreter. To that duty of interpretation, he devoted himself with a singleness of purpose that made even the upheaval of world wars seem to him meaningless disturbances. Nature, it has been said, makes no sudden starts. In a special manner, as the proverb of hell affirms, to create the little flower of genius is the labor of ages. That little flower is, with startling frequency, a flower of evil, springing up amid decay, the vigorous offshoot of a withering stock. As no man acquires his talents or his character overnight, some account must needs be given in this book of the stock which produced the curious but hardy blossom, which is the subject of this study. Through the second half of his long life, my father belonged to the class of the deserving poor. That is to say, to the class of people who richly deserved to be poor. He was born into a middle-class family, which for Ireland was fairly well-to-do. His father was able to live the life of a gentleman, and that, dictionaries tell us, means a man of respectable position who follows no occupation. My grandfather's portraits and photographs show him to have been a handsome man, the handsomest man in Cork, according to my father. He was the only child of an only child, as my father was. The source of my brother's peculiar form of self-exploitation for an artistic purpose, that sublimation of egoism, may well be here in these three generations of only sons. The brilliant young man of promise, my grandfather lived beyond his means. He was fond of hunting, and at one period in his brief career seemed to have owned a racehorse. I fancy from certain vague hints of my father's that he must have been a gambler. One hint was that, marrying at the same time as a friend of his, they had a bet of 10 guineas on who of the two would have a son first. My father won the bet for him, but shortly after birth lost his useful talent for making money. In his weepy moments, my father used to say that when my grandfather rode out to hounds, they would run to look after him. It is to be hoped that the police always had the situation at hand and that the women didn't let the milk boil over. What is certain is that he went through the hoop twice, a circus metaphor, which in careless Ireland means to go bankrupt. It would seem that on the second occasion it was his wife's property, for the Married Women's Property Act had not yet been passed. After the second bankruptcy, he lived with his wife and young son at Sunday's Well, a fashionable suburb of Cork, on an allowance from his father, a prosperous builder and contractor, and perhaps on some desultory occupation. His wife had an annuity settled on her by her father. My grandfather died young, in his early 40s, and his death seems to have been sincerely mourned even by his wife. Next.
He had married a woman of some means, an O'Connell, one of a family of 19, the daughter of the proprietor of one of the largest general stores in Cork. Some of the 19 became priests or nuns, and one, the Reverend Charles O'Connell, again I quote hearsay from my father, was Dean of St. Finbarr's. Another of John Joyce's exaggeration, he was curate of Carrignavar near Cork City, and had some reputation as a preacher. It was a marriage arranged by priests to steady the young man, as one imagines. In Ireland, priests' marriages have a bad name, and my grandfather's marriage proved worthy of that evil repute. As a result, though fervently Catholic, he became very anti-clerical. He handed on his antipathy to priests as a precept to his son and found him apt. His wife was many years older than he. Her portrait towards middle age is that of a stout woman with few pretensions to beauty. She had been educated by the Ursuline nuns, and in the attic of our Martello Terrace house, there were a number of leather-bound French prayer books that she had kept from her convent days, a symbol of culture in Cork, and she was a girl. By all accounts, she had a sharp tongue, and may have had good reason to exercise it. She seemed very soon to have been aware that her tenure of the spouse she had captured was not in fee simple. Once when they were newly married, it came on to rain heavily when they were taking a walk in the country around Cork City. They took refuge in a peasant's cottage, but as the weather showed no signs of clearing up, my grandfather went to the nearest village to get a car to take them home. The peasant woman who was standing at the door of the cottage, looking after him, said, perhaps not so innocently, "Sure, that's a fine woman, a fine young man, God bless him. I suppose now, ma'am, you're his mother." "No, Faith," said the newly married wife, bitter wit. "I'm his grandmother." And
Okay. In the little household that was soon formed, in the little household that was soon formed, his son was his fervent partisan. But even Uncle Charles, still in his old age, impressed by the memory of his brilliant spendthrift brother-in-law, spoke of him as a man of angelic temper. The night he lay dying, he tried to persuade his son to go and hear the aging Mario, who was singing in opera that night in Cork. The serenity of temper, skipping a generation as often happens, descended to his grandson, who was named after him, and who in boyhood and youth was of such a cheerful and amiable disposition that in the family circle he was given the nickname, borrowed from an advertisement for some patent food, of Sonny Jim. My father, as a boy, seemed to have had a good treble voice, for he sang in concert at an early age. He was taught the piano and had a smattering of music. He was, however, a delicate boy, and to strengthen him, my grandfather arranged with the harbour master of Cork to allow him to go out on the pilot boats that went to meet the transatlantic liners, for which in those days Queenstown was a port of call. As a result, no crossing of the Irish Sea, however rough, ever upset him. But besides the robust health which he acquired from the briny Atlantic breezes, he learned from the Queenstown pilots the varied and fluent vocabularies of abuse that in later years was the delight of his barroom cronies. In the pages of Ulysses, he has shocked most of the censors of polite literature in Europe and America. Okay, Katrina.
After the death of his father, who died of typhoid while still in the prime of life, my father's relations with his mother became more and more Byronic. He was inscribed in the Queen's College in the Faculty of Medicine and studied for 3 years, taking a few exams. It was in sports and university theatricals that he shone as a student. He rode in his college fours, was an indefatigable cross-country runner and a useful man at putting the shot in spite of his short stature, and always boasted that his record for the hop, step, and jump 18 feet in the first hop stood for many years after he left the university. but it was in university theatricals that he chiefly distinguished himself. I have seen a dozen or so cuttings from Cork daily papers containing flattering notices of Mr. Joyce's performances in various comic parts. Out of vanity, he preserved them for years and lived like his son on the memory of a youth of promise. The dearest of all things in Ireland is the memory of the past. Some of the notices which Mr. David Marcus, the editor of a Cork Review Irish Writings, kindly took the trouble to seek out for me at my request to show my father to have been a student of no little self-assurance and dramatic ability. In March 1816, the re-establishment of the Queen's College Dramatic Society was announced in the Cork newspapers, but at the first performance in the Royal Theatre Royal on March 11th, there was a rowdy demonstration for political reasons against one of the actors. My father, who was 19 at the time, seems to have restored good humor by singing comic songs. The Cork Examiner says he was exceedingly funny and intensely popular. A few weeks later, in May 1869, he had the principal part in The Irish Emigrant, a farce in one act. The critic of the Southern Reporter says, to Mr. Joyce's acting in the latter piece, it affords us pleasure to be able to refer in terms of unqualified approbation. It was full of quiet humor, genuine and racy of the soil, and admirably sustained. Mr. Joyce is a young gentleman of considerable dramatic talent and excellent promise. A Stater paper, the Cork Examiner, says Mr. J.S. Joyce played the part of O'Brien, the Irish immigrant, in a fashion which, though tinctured with burlesque, a fault of the inexperienced, was far above the rendering of the ordinary amateur. Mr. Joyce's really admirable singing was also applauded as it merited. My father became the mainstay for comic parts of the Queen's College Dramatic Society. Duncan.
After an abortive attempt to volunteer with 3 college friends for the French Army in 1870, he was 21 then, including a flight to London with his mother in stern chase and a crestfallen return, he got mixed up with a Fenian group in rebel Cork, so that his harassed mother decided to leave Cork for good. She was influenced in this decision by the fact that in view of the approaching O'Connell centenary, her cousin, Peter Paul McSweeney, a cousin of the Liberators, had been elected Lord Mayor of Dublin. Note, McSweeney was Lord Mayor in 1875. He hoped the Lord Mayor would make her son his secretary. Before John Joyce started for Dublin, a dinner was given in his honor to it. Since he had been known as a singer on the concert platform in Cork from early boyhood, some members of an English opera company then visiting Cork were invited. At the dinner, there was an informal concert at which the company's leading tenor and my father also sang. When my father had sung some operatic air then in vogue, the English tenor, who seems to have been free from the usual professional jealousy, congratulated him warmly and said he would willingly have given £200 then and there to be able to sing that aria as my father had sung it. Later, when he came up to Dublin, he had many other encouragements of the same kind from people whose opinions in such matter were valued. Full of good intentions, on his arrival in the Irish capital, he went to an Italian lady teacher of singing to have his voice trained. She listened to him sing in a few pieces and then went into the next room to call her grown-up son. "Come and listen to this young man. I have found the successor to Campanini." Joe.
Italo Campanini was the tenor who was then the Furore of Covent Garden and later in 1883 took the part of Faust to inaugurate the Metropolitan Opera in New York. The compliments flattered my father's vanity, but neither aroused any ambition nor stimulated any purpose in him. After middle age, they became part of his stock of consoling recollections, which, unlike his son's ruminations, had no trace of self-criticism, reflection, or regret. It is because I have become hostile to, is it because I have become hostile to my own people, or people by being cut off from them for so long, that I regard this childish, futile vanity as typically Irish? I find it in Yeats, Shaw, Wilde, in Swift, whose breeding at least was Irish. It is almost a criminal instinct when wounded. It was almost a criminal instinct when wounded. Only in Magnanimous Goldsmith was it an amusing foible. It makes the Irish lovers of singularity. My brother was not without it, but in him vanity was stiffened with purpose, and in his struggle with publishers and critics, it became a sort of protective armature against opprobrium and neglect. Joan.
My father did not become the Lord Mayor's secretary, but he invested what remained of £1,000, a coming-of-age gift from his grandfather, in a distillery, the Dublin and Chapelizod Distillery Company, of which he became the secretary. Some of the shareholders were English, but the founders were Corkmen like my father. The manager, whose name my brother has borrowed for the manager in Counterparts, had been a friend of my grandfather's in Cork. My father used to describe him as a kind of duodecimo Lord Chesterfield, a figure still remembered in Ireland. He drove out every morning to Chapelizod, where the distillery was, in a dog cart with a tiger sitting behind him with folded arms. The workmen hated him and once tried to kill him by dropping a heavy beam of timber on him from a gallery when he was going his rounds. My father was quick enough to pull him under a shed an instant before the beam crashed just where he had been standing. My father instead was a favorite with the men with whom he used to play bowls. I do not know how long the secretaryship lasted, about 3 or 4 years it seems, until my father discovered that the manager was embezzling the money of the firm. After a very heated discussion and a torrent of abuse from the manager, which came to an end only when the young secretary was preparing to use violence, my father called a meeting of the shareholders. The manager decamped and the firm was wound up. At the meeting, the shareholders voted their thanks to the young man who had saved them from greater loss and appointed him trustee. Whatever money was realized from the winding up of the distillery was lodged in his name in the Bank of Ireland and must still be there, I presume, unless the statute of limitations is provided for its disposal. The papers of the firm, until at least 10 years later, were kept in a confused mass in a trunk in the attic. At the nadir of his fortunes, he used to wonder half humorously whether he could get at that money, but a worldly wise friend advised him to let his sleeping dog lie. Footnote, the Bank of Ireland reports that it has no money in John Joyce's name. Donna?
A position was found for him as secretary of the National Liberal Club, and he seems to have fulfilled his duties efficiently. At any rate, the National Liberal Club took to itself all the merit of the nationalist victory at a subsequent election, in which one of the ousted Conservative members for Dublin was Sir Arthur Guinness, afterwards Lord Ardilaun, and it rewarded its secretary with a gift of 100 guineas for each elected candidate. Quite a nice little present for a good young man in Dublin 70-odd years ago. There was even some talk of his standing for a constituency, for he had a glib tongue and had been among the first to greet the rising star of Parnell. It was a fanatical, lifelong devotion which he handed on to his eldest son. As for his gift of the gab, accepting the literary allusion which Gabriel Conroy considers above the heads of his listeners, the speech in the Dead is a fair sample, somewhat polished and amended, of his after-dinner oratory. Nothing came of the suggestion. Very probably he had neither the patience nor the docility that elder politicians expect to find in their juniors in the party. Meanwhile, there was no pressing need to work, and he could enjoy life. His mother was independent, and he had a small but sufficient income from house property in Cork. They lived outside Dublin somewhere down along the bay towards Dalkey. He had a little sailing boat and a boy to look after it, and he sang occasionally at concerts. At these, it might happen, if there was a bar near the concert hall, that he would delight his friends in the audience by singing the second verse of a song before the first. Yet he had the proper temperament for a concert singer, and though he did not often sing in public, he knew as well as any old hand how to make an audience friendly towards him in advance, by being perfectly at ease on the stage. At one of the concerts, in which he was the star singer, the accompanist was a professor of the Dublin Conservatory of Music. One of my father's songs had an introduction, nearly a page long, which he liked. But the professor, instead of playing it, strummed a few chords of his own and nodded to my father to begin. But my father stood there looking at him. The professor strummed the chords again and again nodded to him to begin. This time, my father turned around familiarly to his accompanist and said in loud approval, "Bravo, well done, good man." There was so much laughter that it was some time before the professor could at last play the music that was before him, and my father got on with it with his song. Next, please.
In fact, he had a jolly good time of it with his hard-drinking friends of that hard-drinking generation. But however uncritical of himself he may have been, he must have suffered in his self-esteem. He had failed in all the careers that had seemed open so promisingly before him, as a doctor, as an actor, as a singer, as a commercial secretary, and lastly, as a political secretary. He belonged to that class of men regarding whom it is impossible to postulate any social system of which they could be active members. They are saboteurs of life, though they have the name of viveurs. He had natural advantages enough, including the health of an ox, but no character to quicken him. And by character, I mean just belief in oneself. It is astonishing that a father with so little character could beget a son with so much. Being at a loose end, he fell in love again, this time with a Dublin girl. And at least was easy and pleasant. Perhaps, too, he had the illusion that he would enjoy family life, which as an only child he had never known. He always liked very young children, and even when he had a dozen of his own, he would stop in the busy center of the city if he saw a small child toddling on independently in front of its parents, and indifferent as ever to his surroundings, begin a conversation with it. "Isn't that a great little girl, well, Nanny, for you now? And where might you be going this fine day?" The child would stop and look at him, while the slightly embarrassed parents waited for him to have done with it and move on. One of the customers of the distillery was a certain John Murray of Longfoot, an agent for wines and spirits. He had an only daughter, a pretty girl of 19, who played the piano well and had a tuneful voice. My father became a visitor at his house, and in a short time, he and the girl, Mary Jane, were secretly engaged. Some rumor of John Joyce's previous engagements, or perhaps of his drinking bouts, must have reached the father's ears. And though John Murray was by no means a teetotaler, he forbade the match. The couple had little difficulty in finding the means to write to each other and to meet. It was the one and only display of obstinacy in the unhappy life of May Murray. The jealousy of rivals found expression in a nickname for the pair, Beauty and the Beast, which was quite unfair. The note reads, when you made your present choice, they said it was Beauty and the Beast. I can never forgive you for that. Ulysses. My father was quite passably good-looking, dashing, debonair young man. Once the father met them walking together in Grafton Street, a fashionable shopping quarter. He made a scene, called a cab in order to take his daughter home. While they were waiting for the cab to come, a little group of inquisitive people gathered round them. A man in the crowd asked my father what was the matter. Oh, nothing serious, was the glib reply. Just the usual story of a beautiful daughter and the irascible parent. Next.
Urbanity, except in public, was far from being one of his characteristics. In the bosom of his family, he showed quite another face, until his prematurely aged wife died when only 44. The wound to his vanity rankled, and he pursued her father. And when the old man died, his memory, as well as her family, with an unrelenting hatred, an unremitting virulent abuse that had mounted to an obsession. His epithets range from the comic bottle washer in the paper hat to the vitrolic old fornicator, because the old man, after the death of his first wife, married again. The only member of her family who was saved from his scurrilous tongue was her mother, who had been favourable to the marriage. She'd been one of a musical family, Friends of Balf. They are parodied somewhat in The Dead. She had a trained voice, though she never sang in concerts, and seemed to have liked her son-in-law. And that unaccountable man, who never could agree with mother, wife, or children, always treated the memory of his mother-in-law with respect. She owed her immunity, in part at any rate, to dying in the early years marriage. They were married on the 5th of May, 1880, when her mother was not yet 21, and went on their honeymoon to London. Already on the wedding trip, the husband began to swear at his too patient wife. While they were boating on the Thames at Windsor, he noticed that a fellow with a girl in another boat was trying to pass him. During the impromptu race that ensued, he cursed his girl bride fluently for not steering the boat straight. And when he had outdistanced his rival and could ease off, he made a joke of the violent language he had used in the heat of his excitement. In fact, one of his maxims was, never apologize. Through influence, a job was found for him in the office of the Collector General of Rates and Taxes, in order that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of by the prophet, that he should be numbered with tax collectors and sinners. His own mother had been opposed to the match. They are a troublesome people, John. And when her son, her only child, married, she went back to Cork. He never saw her again. She died alone. Anne?
My brother has made use of this incident in Exiles. For no writer in English sense, Stern had exploited the minute, unpromising material of his immediate experience so thoroughly as my brother did, using it in order to delineate character or complete his picture of an environment. Some critics have insisted on the resemblance between my brother and Stern, basing their comparison on whimsicalness of style, originality in the construction of the novel, the patent accumulation of detail for a purpose that at first puzzles the reader, and still more intimately on the dominant motives in the heart of both writers. The devotion to a father's memory, the hostility to a mother's wishes, the hateful call to active life in a form repugnant to all their souls long for. There was undoubtedly a vague Hamlet complex, both in Stern and in my brother. Although Stern, in the loss of the father as a result of a silly Jew, suffered in early youth a heavy blow to his deepest affection, and thus might have had reason to cultivate a tragic outlook on life. He refused to do so. He chose to be Yorick because he did not wish to be Hamlet. My brother was of a far more inflexible metal. His attitude towards his mother never reached the point of contempt that Stern's did, nor was it ever personally hostile. He was at loggerheads with her because he would have no truck with the religion to which she owed fidelity. Moreover, the vagaries of his style are purposeful. For him, literature was not a comforting pastime that half lulls, half encounters the conscience. It offered other satisfactions, grim realizations that dethrone tyrannical secrets in the heart and awaken in it a sense of liberation. And of sympathy too. In the mirror of his art, the ugliness of the Gorgon's head may be clearly reflected, but it is cleanly severed and does not turn the beholder's heart to stone. Katrina?
He shared with Sterne, however, an innate skepticism in regard to the resplendent events and sumptuous personages that novelists deal in. I often ask myself how it is that such personages do not become prime ministers not only of England, that would be too little, but of Europe. No less a destiny seems fitting for such outsized men and women. I have known at least a few people who have reached the highest plane of celebrity, but they have succeeded by believing in one or two things wholeheartedly. Nor were their relations with other men and women like a page of Henry James' neat and orderly prose. In early youth, my brother had been in love, like all romantic poets, with vast conceptions and had believed in the supreme importance of the world of ideas. His gods were Blake and Dante, but then the minute life of earth claimed him, and he seemed to regard as with a kind of compassion his youth deluded by ideals that exacted all his service, the big words that make us so unhappy, as he called them. Yet he had believed in them wholeheartedly, in God, in art, or rather in the duty, he would not have called it duty, imposed on him by the possession of talent. Duncan?
Okay, perhaps I don't think we have time to comfortably finish this section. So perhaps it is 2:19 now. Perhaps we can stop here and have a discussion for a while, and then we can pick up at this place next Monday. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, so that means it's going to be 4:29. All right. Stanislaus is just as described.
One thing that came out that we had discussed in reading something else, and I can't remember the exact discussion we had, but it was about Joyce's admiration and love for his father, which came out from Stanislaus also in this book.
You mean that Stanislaus is saying that James had love and admiration for his father?
Yes.
Okay.
That we had talked about that before.
Mm-hmm. I think that James Joyce found his father exceedingly interesting and definitely mined many of his stories and songs, and could report his father's behavior in an amusing manner. I'm still not convinced about how much respect he had for him.
Well, I think Stanislaus actually says so somewhere here that we just read.
I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to find it quickly.
Okay. Well, it'll probably come up again. as we read in the book.
Mm. I'll find
You know, it's very interesting reading this, but it's a good thing that Stanislaus was a teacher and not a writer.
not an author.
In my humble opinion.
I was not aware that Joyce went to college at the age of 5 or something like that.
No, I think they're using the word college in a different way.
They must be.
Clongowes College, it's a high school.
He went to Clongowes.
Oh.
Yeah.
He was 6.
Yeah, so the order was he went to Clongowes and then later he went to Belvedere.
Then he went to
Yeah.
And then he went to
University
University
of
College Dublin.
Yeah.
I found that the Stanislaus's description of James Joyce's fear of thunder to be quite something.
Yeah.
very, very instructive.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. And I don't know if I accept his Stanislaus's excuse for that to be Dante putting the fear of God into James as well as the school, the Catholic. But it's interesting to why. I mean, I don't like thunder, and we have spectacular lightning storms here in Texas. And I used to have I've had a series of dogs, and dogs really don't like thunder at all. We had to let them in the hallway, and even in the hallway, they would be whimpering and shaking violently the whole time. It was pretty dramatic.
I had a collie like that, and if we had the storm at night, he used to jump into bed with my husband and I under the covers.
Yeah. The fireworks drive them crazy as well,
Yeah.
Halloween or whatever, it's amazing, to go.
The reaction.
Well, you can see, I mean, at least I can see why Joyce was interested in Vico, since Vico made such a big deal out of thunder.
and the significance of the clap of thunder.
I went through a period where I was very, very much afraid of storms, and went on for several years. Finally worked it out that it was a feeling of having lost control of my life. And I was trying to apply that to Joyce, but I couldn't. It didn't fit for him. But it could have been, there could have been a real reason, behind that.
Oh, yeah.
That wouldn't necessarily continue throughout his life,
Well,
But
I know that.
It's terrible to have that feeling. It's awful.
Yes.
Glad to get rid of it. I'm very glad to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But Joyce doesn't just have that fear. He's if my reading of things, he's got 3 fears like that. The second is of dogs, and what's the third fear? There's the thunder, the dogs, and cattle.
Cattle.
Yeah, cattle in the street. Now I can understand the last one of those because I was always frightened as a child by the cattle being brought through down to the boats.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I still remember it as one of the most violent scenes I never want to see again in my life. And by the way, I went to another port in Dublin once, like about 10 years ago, and there was a boat loading cattle, and the cattle were going down the quay where I was driving, and I got the same fear again. So I can, you know, it's from childhood.
Mhm.
So
Must to be.
it's there's
So
three
they
that he's
they
got
were
this,
running them through the streets.
they ran down the quays. Well, they had to take them from, you know, the way Bloom was always saying, why don't they run a railway line from the
Yeah,
cattle
yeah. Mhm.
all the way down to the boat? Well, everyone in Dublin said that to each other because they used to take them along the road.
Mhm.
And it was very frightening for a child.
Yeah.
I can
and
understand it.
but I'm just saying there's something in Joyce's sensitivity
Hmm.
that you just have three sets of fears, you know, and I could understand each one. I think if I'd be bitten by a dog, maybe I too would sort of kind of panic when I'd see a dog. So it's interesting. I'm just not answering the question. I'm just sort of exploring it.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's kind of the thought of the possibility of being attacked or run over
Yeah.
or hit. That it's a possibility of harm to you.
Oh yeah, and the men driving those cattle were as
It's
frightening
about
as
as close.
they were very violent.
Yeah, right. That I think that's the actual problem.
Yeah.
Cattle by their nature are not, they don't rampage. It's very, you know, I mean, maybe if they're out in the field and there's lightning and thunder, they may run for shelter, but by their nature, cattle are pretty take it easy,
Yeah.
except when they're being driven,
Yeah.
Mm.
As
and
essentially,
particularly in narrow spaces.
oh yeah, they're being panicked. Same time, they're curious. If you step into a field of cattle, I was going to ask Donna what he thought of that. There's just, I don't know if you have this experience, Donna. You step into a field of cattle, they get very curious. They come over to you,
Yeah.
and they come over to you at a trot that looks like a herd of cattle charging you, and then you run and they run.
It is
Oh,
scary.
okay.
My experience of that, Joe, was I come from a town called Thurles in County Tipperary, and it was what was called a market town.
Yeah.
So every Wednesday, the cattle were brought into a large square in the town. The shopkeepers would board up their windows because while the cattle were gentle, they were big animals. And if they leaned into a window, they'd crack it.
Yeah,
But,
right.
you know, coming home from school, you'd be walking through the town and you'd be walking through the cattle. And it was quite a daunting experience. You know, they were large animals, even though they weren't threatening in any way, but their curiosity was very true. They could look you straight in the face.
Yeah.
You were wondering if anything was going on behind those eyes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I grew up in the country and we used to walk through cattle in the fields all the time. But it wasn't the cattle so much. They were quite curious. But if you had dogs with you, they'd kind of chase the dogs and you had to be careful with the dogs. But it was the bulls that were the real dangerous thing was.
Yeah.
If you had a bull amongst the cattle, sometimes you wouldn't notice, sometimes you would know. But you had to be very wary of the bulls, yeah.
Yeah, no, bulls are a different story.
That's a different story. And they actually often killed the people that were most familiar with them. You know, you'd hear of farmers being killed by bulls, and they were very familiar with them, you know.
My brother-in-law
by Padraig Colum, you know, to meet of the pasture, some wet hills by the sea, through Leitrim and Longford go my cattle and me. I hear in the darkness they're slipping and breathing. I name them the byways they're to pass without heeding. And he goes on in that fashion where the drovers used to drive the cattle up to Dublin, and they had the cattle market there at Hanlon's Corner, and around Prussia Street and Manor Street and that, But I think cattle confined are a different story, and when they're in the
Yes.
market, or when they're approaching the boats to be loaded and sent off, or even worse, when they're approaching the abattoir, they get a terrible
Yes.
sense of what's going to happen to them. And so there's all that kind of thing about the cattle. Yeah.
There is a woman writer in the United States who is autistic, who Temple Grandin. Your microphone is off, Lois, by the way.
Temple Grandin.
Yes.
Temple Grandin, and her specialty is going. I don't know if it's still her specialty. Her specialty now might be writing books, but she would be hired by slaughterhouses to design the runs in such a way to keep the cattle as calm as possible. And it would be very odd things. She had a thing, I think she had a thing to where if they saw something in their peripheral vision, as they're being funneled into these things, and all of a sudden they felt like they were being squeezed, they would freak out and start, throwing their heads around and their bodies around, etc. So, but anyway, so James Joyce, Thunder, dog, holy moly, dogs. But there's an explanation there. He's bitten by a dog, but I was bitten by a dog, and to this very day, I don't trust beagles because it was a beagle who bit me.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I'm cautious around dogs, and I try to read them. But it may be this very sensitivity to
It's a
these
measure of
things.
sensitivity, maybe. Like we all have one, but Joyce has three fears, three times as sensitive as his.
Maybe part of a package, though,
Yeah,
of being so good at detecting details in character and actions, and it may be part of a package there. Plus, I mean, when you have bad eyesight,
Yeah, that's another issue.
and there is this whole debate about when I mean, I know in Portrait of an Artist we had the early scene of the older boy, stepping, his glasses get broken and all that, but I'm not sure when his eyesight really got bad.
Yeah.
That's actually a great couple of lines by Stanislaus, setting out that this is a novel. Portrait is a novel, not a biography. That's really well said. I'm going to go back and mark those out, because that's a message you have to get across about Ulysses when you're talking to people. I just changing kind of the tack a bit, because I think this is good. You see, I'm actually heading down on Thursday with my library group to visit the house today we've just been reading about. So I'm preparing a little material, so I don't end up there standing, thinking of something to say. And I've come across, there's a Bray Boat Club, which is a rowing club, of which John Joyce was a member. And I think this is a very telling little snippet. There's a public concert held by the boat club. I don't know where, but it's held. And the program lists the three artists from the Joyce family. One is Mr. J.S. Joyce. That's John Stanislaus. The second is Mrs. J.S. Joyce. And the third is Master James Joyce. It's held in 1888. Joyce is 6 years of age. And he's on stage.
Yeah.
And it also, this is another book on James Joyce by a different, it's kind of, I go bet the houses. But like from 4 years of age, he was regaling visitors to the house to play the piano and sing for them. Now, he was probably playing Three Blind Mice, you know, with one finger. Boom, boom. But can you see the precociousness of the child?
Yeah. Mm.
So
It's
but
funny
that
that
his
yeah,
name
that,
is on the character, you know, the performers. He's named as a performer at 6 years of age.
and he
Yeah.
and he sang that song Houlihan's Cake that Joyce never forgot about. Is it in Ulysses? I think it is. I think, yeah, or Finnegan's Way. I'm not sure which, but it's definitely there.
I think it's
There
in
were
the way.
plums. There were plums and something and raisins and something and cinnamon too.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's interesting that Stanislaus mentions that word. What you said, Joe, precocious. Like he was you know, at that age he was still, you know, and that thing about coming down the stairs. Here
Yeah.
Here comes me. Here comes me.
Here comes me.
Comes me. Yeah.
Comes everybody. Yeah.
Here we go.
It's really good. Yeah.
Sonny Jim.
He was the fair-haired boy.
Yeah.
But
you remember that?
And the oldest who survived.
Yeah.
As I understand it. So that's.
Remember when Bloom comes down from breakfast and he's when he's preparing the breakfast and he opens the envelope, comes down and opens the envelope from Millie, and his thoughts go, "Oh, Millie Bloom, you are my darling. I can't remember. I love you more than da, 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 da. And it's that poem that was on the card that the next door neighbor's father wrote in, and Joyce's mother intercepted. And also Jumbo Jumbo said, you know, this is his father. Jumbo said to Alice, "I love you." Oh, this is the grandfather. Jumbo said to Alice, "I love you." Alice said to Jumbo, "I don't believe you do. For if you really loved me, as you say you do, you'd never go to Yankee Town and leave me in the zoo." And among the people, Jumbo the elephant loves Alice the elephant. You know that it's Cyclops, isn't it? Where there, there's Bloom, the new preacher to the world of love, because he's saying love, and the narrator begins to say everybody loves everybody, but everybody loves somebody, and the man in the Macintosh loves the woman who's dead, and Alice the elephant loves Jumbo the elephant, but only everybody loves somebody, but only God loves everybody. This ridiculous thing. And there's the origin of it. Like, you could sit with this book, and like I wish I could get my hands on a really good family history of Joyce, get all the Duffys and all these other names that are in there, because I can never remember which relations you're talking about when many generations back.
Maybe there's a poster in the future.
I'd love a poster up on my wall for that I could just look up at and say,
So did you hear echoes of Evelyn in that section about, the husband that left and went away to Argentina?
Oh, Buenos Aires. Yeah.
Buenos Aires.
Dante's
Dante's husband basically abandoned her and went to Argentina.
And took her money.
Yeah.
And took her money. Yes, there we go.
Yeah. She'd be better going into the convent for the money.
No wonder Dante was different, though. The outcome for Evelyn was different. They lived happily ever after.
For the real Evelyn.
Yeah.
Like the real Evelyn was not a relation. He was a neighbor of the Joyces in whatever street that's called, and But this is that man who. Oh, that's Dante. It's outside the family altogether, isn't it? Dante's the both. Yeah, Buenos Aires as a place for, fast and loose movers,
Well, I don't know. I don't know the history of Buenos Aires, but I would think at that particular time, I mean, there were a lot of Italians A lot of Europeans were going into Buenos Aires and, basically took it over
Oh
over
yeah,
time.
yeah. It's colonialism, soft power.
Hmm. There he goes. He certainly did. He left for Buenos Aires with the greater part of his wife's fortune, and she never saw him or it again.
Yes, again.
She was to have followed him, but his letters, always few and far between, became rarer and rarer.
Yeah. Well, you can understand her bitterness, can't you?
Indeed.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, we're going to read that dinner, the Christmas dinner thing. So
Mhm. And I'm going to make a wild guess, but I would think at that particular time that if a man married a woman with money, that he had access to that money.
oh yeah,
I'd say more than access. I'd say he had control.
control. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's only been, well, credit cards in the United States, women have only been able to allowed to have credit cards for 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I believe that bank accounts might have been the same way if a woman was married.
Oh yeah. In the 1960s in Ireland, a married woman could not open a bank account.
Hmm. And
It might be,
probably the husband would be the prime
oh yeah,
the
the husband
prime
would
signature on it.
yes, I could go to the bank with my wife and open an account, but it'd be in my name, and she would be a signatory, an authorized signatory on it.
Hmm.
She couldn't go in there on her own and do it,
Yeah.
So
So I would say that's probably how Dante's husband was able to go to the
Mhm.
bank one day and draw the money out and go to Buenos Aires.
oh yeah, like that would
But,
that's what marriage does. That's why there was dowry payments, and there was a thing called curtsy, which was the other way around. So if I was in the situation I'm marrying a millionairess, then I have to pay an amount in to cover what I'll be drawn out. That sort of way, capital sum. But that had long since stopped altogether. That's why all these American millionairesses were when they're going to Paris in the 1920s and 30s, and all these ne'er-do-good writers trying to marry a millionairess. Like, what was her name? Cunard. What was Joan Cunard? What was it? Nancy Cunard.
Oh, right.
So,
Yeah.
but a terrible system, really. You think about it, like.
Oh, yeah, it is a terrible system. I mean, this is in Japan. What happened was that when women became able to have bank accounts and whatnot,
Yeah.
and had still restricted, but much more freedom than they had ever had before,
Yeah.
they just stopped getting married.
Yeah.
They just decided that it wasn't worth it to have a husband, and they stopped. There's a huge percentage of women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that never have been married, never will get married.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, because it is at the end of the day, in those circumstances, a financial decision, and unfortunately, too much of a financial decision to make. What's her name? Tom, what's the name of the book I'm reading? Dear Miss Weaver, Harriet Weaver was of the opinion.
Oh, okay.
She was of that opinion. She never married because it made no sense either for man or woman. She considered, I think she's a great character.
Yeah.
It's almost gone that way now for men, like you kind of, you be careful. If I was a 20-something, I'd be very careful about getting married,
Oh, well, there's an unending parade of stories of
Yeah.
people, male or female, being taken advantage of in their old age.
Yeah.
There's actually a dedicated predatory class in the United States that you have to really watch out for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fortunately, I actually witnessed that with my mother. Not that anybody wanted to marry her, but as she got older and not as clear in mind, there were a lot of people more than willing to take advantage of her generous nature.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So,
But yeah, you have to be careful with friendships being formed by people who think you've got wealth. You know?
mhm, mhm.
The other thing that I thought was kind of thing there was that John Joyce he got on with his mother-in-law,
Mhm.
and she was for him as well,
Yeah.
Yeah, it was this kind of strange kind of thing. He tested all the rest of the family, but for some reason he got on with her.
Mhm.
Maybe it kind of says because she was in favor of the wedding, but yeah.
Well, there was a hint about her background. She had a little unusual aspect to her background. I don't know. She was I forget what it was.
They had music in common.
In music, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
But there's a street, I know it's Upper or Lower Compasses Street. I don't know, Tom and Donna I can never remember whether there's an upper, but there's a street called Compasses Street, a street that runs from Leonard's Corner to Hurls Cross Bridge on the canal.
Clanbrassil Street.
Compasses Street, is that D? Isn't
Yeah.
there an upper and a lower? But if
I don't
if
think
that's-
there's an upper or lower in it, Jen.
No, if that's the street, this where my fingernail is where Joyce's mother's family live. What's their name?
Murray.
Murray's?
Murray's.
Murray.
Murray lived there, and when John was chasing after Mary Jane, he had the gall to take a room in a house here where my other fingernail is. They didn't approve of him. So he was now kind of on their doorstep. And Joyce, when he writes Ulysses, puts Bloom being born in a house there, right? Opposite where Stanislaus. And over here he puts, what's your man that goes after with the cost bag of whatever, and the guy that
Richie Goulding.
Richie Goulding, born here, living here, rather, and that's where Murray's real uncle was living. Yeah, Murray's brother, in other words, Joyce's uncle, was living there. So you have two real characters on the road set against two fictitious characters. Perfect symmetry. And you can stand on the bridge here and look down, and it's like you're looking inside Joyce's brain. You know, to your right fiction, to your left reality. It's like it's just amazing. And then you go around the corner and you find Bloomfield Avenue. Hello, Bloomfield Avenue. Where have we heard that word bloom before? It's that's the Jewish quarter. So you're and you can push on there and get other similarities very, very soon just by wandering around in a random fashion. But I love that idea of the symmetry.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's there, but there was no mention of him in this of John taking that renting that room. Imagine if you didn't want Mary and your daughter moving in 20 paces away from you.
Well, the daughter must have been, I mean, obviously to get involved with John Joyce, she had to be willing to be interested in him and to resist most of her family's opinions of him.
Yeah, but that's the teenage stuff. She sang in a choir in a church you can just about walk to from there. And Joyce joined the choir.
Yeah.
Rackar Church, the the Three Patrons Church in and that's one of the places where Bloom has been baptized.
Okay, okay. And
But you go there and you can still go in. Well, you're supposed to go in there to pray. You're not supposed to go in there on tourism trips.
Yeah.
But if you slip quietly in and behave yourself and sit down quietly, and that you can eventually, go into the little door that goes up to the choir, and it's those narrow stairs that I have.
Mhm, mhm.
You can see, he might have kind of been very closer than usual to her on the stairs there.
Yeah.
But she, one of the things I'm giving out in my little trip tomorrow is that the girl that James Joyce did not marry, that little article I think we had mentioned before, Eileen Vance, because she's next door neighbor in the house we're going to, and Eileen Vance wrote a lovely account of her childhood. She lived to be over 100, and in Canada, and she describes Joyce's mother. It's very interesting, as a very beautiful lady who always had a friendly welcome and a kiss for a visiting child. You get a very, very different, much more warm, motherly impression than you get of the fictitious Simon's mother. So,
Right.
Stephen's mother.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting. So you can see where my mind was going during that reading.
Well, it makes perfect sense that during the younger years that she would be attracted to someone like John Stanislaus. Because he sang and he was a very sociable type person. But I mean, and here I'm kind of making stuff up, but over the years, as he loses his fortune and he makes one bad decision after another, and they have more children, and they have to keep moving to a new place,
and there's a touch of violence.
Out of embitterment.
But it's the older story with teenagers. You say, marry in haste, regret at your leisure. We're getting married. We had to be married in 3 months' time because that's where we don't want, we want to get a move on and all that sort of stuff, But marry in haste, regret at your leisure. By the way, I said tomorrow, it's Thursday I'm going. What day is it? Tuesday, isn't it? Tuesday.
Today is Monday.
It's Monday.
Well, it's not tomorrow. It's Thursday.
Thursday. Okay.
You have more time to get ready than you thought, Joe.
I have to get, but I do and I don't, but I need all the time. But because of other things. But I've if I'm not on Thursday, it's because either I'm still in Bray or I'm capable of really coming on because it's quite I'm traveling by public transport. It's going to be quite an expensive journey for me.
Joe, can you take some pictures?
I can't because I don't have a camera. I don't have an iPhone, but the others will. I'm sure. Okay. I just have to be a bit careful with pictures because it's a private property. So I'll ask permission, and if I get permission, I'll tell them. I mean, they'll all whip out their phones and take them, and then I'll ask them to send them to me, and then we should be okay.
Okay.
But I do actually have photographs of the inside of it. Already, but I don't have permission, you see, to put them up on a recorded broadcast, So,
okay.
I'll try to get it. Like at the end of the day, it's a private household, So I just want to be ultra careful. I don't want to get. I want them to let me in again, next year. So there we go. But Thursday, God.
Wow. Exciting.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, it's always possible. Tom has done it.
And Cecilia would have, I think you mentioned Joe, she would have a picture somewhere.
Oh yeah, I've all Cecilia's pictures. She sent them to me. But again, it's a house, you know. It's
Yeah.
like taking a photograph of here. You know,
Private, yeah.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
there's no displays of, you know, it's
Mhm.
not a museum with things that you can sort of look at or so you have to travel your. What I would love is a photograph of the views out the windows.
Mm.
Interesting tonight, because one of the questions I was going to ask was, do they have any knowledge of where the bedrooms were, where the Stanislaus and James might have had their bedroom?
Mm.
It's interesting. He says upstairs,
Mm.
because I had the feeling they were down at the back, that there were bedrooms. But I'm going to ask the owner tomorrow and see, or on Thursday, and see if she have anything. But they you know they would have bought the house whenever they bought it. Like, they didn't inherit it with papers and
Mhm, mhm.
stuff. So anyway, if you're ever in Ireland, at this stage of the game, I still have a good relationship with the owner. I don't know whether by Friday I still have. But if anyone's ever in Ireland and you want to see that house,
You know,
I go there with you. I'll bring you in there.
it's becoming more of a possibility all the time.
You'll be in what's it called in Rapmines? Martin B. Slattery's in Rapmines. You'll get the full gold-plated treatment.
Well, I'm going. I actually, this is off topic, but you know, I'm a very COVID cautious person,
Yeah.
and I saw one study that came out that was talking about the latest vaccine, the Novavax, and it said that the follow-ups on that have shown that it is 95% effective 10 months later.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I went on Saturday. I found a place and I went and I was all excited. I thought, God, I'll get this shot. And then, you know, a couple of weeks I'll start going out in public because, you know, those odds are okay for me.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
live with those odds.
Yeah.
And I get there and I'm waiting and the woman comes over and she says, I'm the one that you made the appointment with yesterday. And I have to apologize that when I went to get the vaccine out, it turns out that all of the Novavax vaccine we have is expired, and I can't.
Can't do it.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
Well, yeah. There was a case in our group that I don't know, Tom, if you were following the Finnegan's Wake, the FW85 group, that was kind of visiting Oris and Uachtaráin with the president, and Jim Keeley was over from the States and all this sort of stuff. But one
Cecilia said she was going up to the
yeah. I was I this recorded, so I won't say name, but one of that group contracted COVID. Subsequently, but it was only one, and it wasn't at that event. Given that our president is in poor health, you know, it wouldn't be good news. But so, like, that's in the last 3 weeks, 2 weeks, case of COVID, just happening from a person who, you know, would have had it once, twice before. And then last week, you might have noticed I wasn't well. I contracted a virus and I was unwell, very unwell, on whatever days it was, on the Monday, and I was very unwell that night, and I had all last week till Friday, and I was sure it was COVID, you know, when I got it, but when I tested, you know,
it wasn't okay. Well, that's good.
And they were all negative. But for a moment, I thought I had caught the bloody virus. You know, so it's this factor. It's still out there, and I'm being very cautious now. Like, I'm as cautious as I was. I'm not jumping on. I know I'm using public transport on Thursday, but that's because and I'm not going on public transport between this and then because I don't want to catch anything.
Right.
And just, you know, just kind of because
anyway, I'm hoping that there will be a trip to Ireland in the
Yeah,
not too distant future.
there you go. Well,
In
that
the
would be great
meantime,
fun. That would be
yeah,
great fun. We
in
might
the
all
mean-
come out of hiding for that.
hopefully things will continue to get better. Right now is not too bad. It is 1 minute after the hour. And so in keeping with the limit in my mind, I should click the red button after I tell everybody that, we'll meet again. And it's been a
Thank you.
really informative and fun time today.
Yeah, me too.
No,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.